Reading with your kids.
Hola, ni hao, konnichiwa, assalamu alaikum, shalom, mahaba, moni moli wanji, namaste, jambo, bienvenidos. Hi, my name is Jed Lee, and this is the Reading with Your Kids podcast. We are coming to you from the beautiful neighborhood of Reedville in the southwest corner of Boston, Massachusetts, in the shadow of the Great Blue Hills. We are so delighted and so very honored that you're joining us in our mission to help all families grow closer through reading. Please be sure to tell all of your family and friends about the show. Tell your kids, teachers, principals, and librarians. And please be sure to subscribe to the show on the iHeartRadio app, on Spotify, Apple Podcast, Amazon Music, Himalaya, Ghana, Podcast Addict, Good Pod, wherever you find your podcasts. Hey, quick question. Are you raising a reader? Are you ready to embark on a journey of imagination and adventure with your family? Then look no further than Dear Fam, the ultimate destination for family reading fun. Join the Dear Fam movement and unlock your child's love for reading with Dear Fam, the reading journal tracking app. Develop critical thinking skills. Set up reading goals with your child as they earn reading badges. Get notified when your child shares their reading journals. Share with family, friends, and teachers. Start your family's next reading adventure today with Dear Fam. That's spelled D-E-A-R-F-A-M, where reading together means bonding forever. Dear Fam, now available on the App Store and at Google Play. Dear Fam. This episode of the Reading with Your Kids podcast is brought to you by I Am Musical, Adventures of Waffles, written by Barbara Brown. Waffles is a feisty and funny dog who cannot play an instrument, sing, or compose music, but somehow is convinced that she is musical. In this book, Crouton the Corgi spends the day trying to figure out how his best friend Waffles could possibly be musical when all she does is make a musical mess everywhere she goes. This story is an opportunity for children to see themselves as valid and important contributors to our musical culture, regardless of their musical abilities, while also being the first of its kind to remind children and their parents that music belongs to all of us. Get your copy today. I Am Musical, Adventures of Waffles, written by Barbara Brown. Joining us right now from right outside of New York City, our guest is here today to celebrate her new middle grade novel. It's called Unstuck. Please welcome to the show, Barbara D. Hey, Barbara, how are you?
Great. How are you?
Wonderful. I'm delighted to have you on. Tell us all about Unstuck, please.
Unstuck is my 14th middle grade novel for Simon & Schuster. It's about a 7th grader named Lila, who is dealing with some stuff. She's in the process of losing her best friend. At home, her older sister, who is a superstar high school senior, is resisting applying to college. So that's throwing the family into chaos. And while all this is going on, Lila is trying to prove herself by writing a fantasy novel for her ELA class. And because she's pressuring herself so much, she develops a nasty case of writer's block and can't produce this story. And luckily for her, she's got a fantastic teacher who works with her to get her unstuck.
You know, for us, the issues that you described, like, we can deal with that. It's no, but for a 7th grader, being stuck, having your sister involved in this turmoil and the turmoil that the family's experiencing, that's a pretty big, dramatic thing to happen in a kid's life.
It is. It is. But, I think the book has a lightness to it because she's a voracious reader of fantasy fiction. And so, she is trying to produce a fantasy novel, and it's fun to see her use those fantasy tropes and referred to books that a lot of kids will have read. And, there is a lot of humor in the book. I often try to incorporate as much humor as possible when I write about serious themes, which I do in my books. I never want my books to be too heavy, even when they're exploring a serious theme.
Mm-hmm.
I think it's important for kids to be entertained, even as, their thoughts are being challenged and expanded.
Mm-hmm.
So I like a mix of serious and not so serious in my books.
Yeah. Lila sounds like a fun kid to hang out with. What's going on with her friend? Why is she in fear of losing her friend?
Well, Lila has one of those friendships that kids often develop, where it's a very intense best friendship that somehow starts to feel a little claustrophobic to one of the kids in the friendship, but maybe not to the other kid.
Mm-hmm.
And when these two girls, Lila and Rania, enter middle school, they go to two different middle schools. It's the way that their town is set up, just like my town. And so Lila is suddenly on her own, and she's not a very extroverted kind of kid, so she's having a hard time plugging into a new group of friends. Meanwhile, her friend Rania is using the experience of having a new middle school as a way to sort of expand her circle of friendship. And so she's becoming involved with all these athletes, and she's very happy to have new relationships, and she is trying to incorporate Lila into these new relationships, but Lila feels kind of betrayed. And when she talks about being a writer to her new group, to Rania's new friends, she feels like they don't understand what that means, and they're judging her, and they're sort of mocking her, and she is desperate to prove herself to Rania and these new friends, but they're really not interested in her writing. Mm-hmm. So, it becomes clear that Rania is trying to break away. And it's a very healthy thing. I think, middle school, when I think of middle school friendships, I see them as extremely volatile and fluid. And all the time, kids' friendships end in middle school, and it's traumatic. I wanted to depict a friendship that ends and doesn't resolve. Mm-hmm. A friendship that ends, and that is really the ending. But that's okay, because it's an opportunity to make a new friend, which mm-hmm. Lila does. I didn't want to write a book where, kids fall apart and then come back together again, because that's not really realistic. That's not really what happens in middle school. Friendships do end, and I wanted to show kids that that's okay. It's survivable.
Yeah, that is important. And I think it's really important for us to understand that friendships end, relationships end, and it's okay. And it's, as you said, it's something that you can survive.
Right. And for kids in middle school, it's often when a friendship ends, it feels like the end of a romance. I mean, mm-hmm. It's traumatic. Kids become, devastated by it. So, one of the things that's great about reading a book is that kids hang out with the characters, they befriend the characters, and they sort of participate vicariously in things like friendships ending, and see that it is survivable, because when it happens to them, they can remember, oh yeah, I remember that book. It sort of models what it's like to end a friendship and then pick up the pieces and move on. Yeah. It's important for kids.
Absolutely. We've talked a lot here on the podcast about how valuable books are as a way, as you were just saying, for kids to kind of imagine themselves in different situations and figure out how they would handle it if they found themselves in those situations. Was there a friendship that you had that you were thinking about as you started to create this story, or something that your kids went through?
Yes, I mean, but not detail by detail, just in a general way. I have 3 kids, and in middle school, all 3 of them experienced friendships ending and the trauma of that, and then different friendships developing as a result of those breakups. And I remember, how emotional it was. But I also remember that on the very first day of middle school, my kids had a principal who said to them, he called all the kids together into the auditorium, and he said to them, look who you're sitting next to on your left and look who you're sitting next to on your right. I can guarantee you on 8th grade graduation, you will be sitting next to 2 different kids. And he was right.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. One of the things I saw on your website is that you like to write books about smart kids facing real challenge with resilience and humor. How do you think we can foster that resilience in our kids?
Well, I think one of the most important things we can do is have conversations with kids about some of the issues I write about. And I think it is so useful for parents and kids to talk about books that they share, to talk about the characters in books that are going through some of this stuff. Because I think what happens in middle school a lot of times is kids stop talking to their parents. They don't want to tattle on their friends. They may also want to just sort of, have a little bit of privacy or a little bit of independence. But the truth is they're still, quite dependent on their parents, and they do care what their parents think. So if you're reading a book together, it's less threatening for kids to open up, because you can talk about the characters in the book. What do you think about the way this character spoke to her parent? Should she have said something different? What do you think about the parent's reaction? What would you do if you were in the situation? Who would you talk to? Do you think so-and-so is really a good friend? What makes a good friend? You can have really important conversations that touch on the things that your kid is really going through without your kid feeling like you're crowding them, like you're prying about their lives. I was at the Chappaqua Children's Book Festival last year, and a mother and a daughter came over to my table, and they both pointed at books on my table, and I said, "Oh, have you both read my books?" And the mom said, "I read all these books first, and then I give them to my daughter when she goes to sleepaway camp. And the whole summer when she's at sleepaway camp, we write back and forth to each other about the books. And this gives us a common language." Because the mother is not at sleepaway camp. The mother doesn't know all the kids that the daughter is dealing with, or the counselors, or whatever it is. So they are, they don't have a common language, but the books give them a common language, and they can talk to each other about an experience that they're both sharing. And I think that's a really great way to build resilience in kids, because, you're talking, if you're sharing the experience of reading a book about a kid going through something, whatever it is, a family crisis, something like writer's block, whatever it is. And you can talk about, or the ending of a friendship. You can talk about how the kid dealt with it, the choices the kid makes, the options the kids had. And it helps the kid build resilience.
Yeah, absolutely. We are big advocates of parents continuing to read with their kids long after they become independent readers, especially in middle grades and in high schools. We've suggested a number of really powerful books, books that were written for adults that I think parents and high schoolers could read together and really get a lot out of. If nothing else, what you said, just having that conversation where here's something we can talk about, and
Exactly.
and just kind of grow closer, because no matter what our kids are saying to us, we are still the most important people in their lives.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And what our kids are not saying to us, there's still a lot of stuff in the middle school years where kids are not communicating. One of the reasons I wrote my book, Maybe He Just Likes You, is one day my daughter said to me, could you pick me up so I don't have to take the school bus? And I didn't think too hard about why she wanted me to pick her up. I just could do it, so I did it. And then a few years later, she told me that the reason she didn't want to take the bus anymore was because stuff was happening on the bus, like what happens to the main character in Maybe He Just Likes You. And my daughter and I are very close, and yet somehow she didn't feel comfortable telling me that. Mm-hmm. So, I think parents can delude themselves by thinking they know everything going on with their middle schooler, because they don't.
Yeah.
And, the experience of sharing a book allows for more communication.
Yeah. It's interesting you say that. When my son was in middle school, it was back in the early 2000s and the teens, and I was running around the country doing anti-bullying shows and being called an anti-bullying expert, and would come home and talk to my kids and say, how's everything at school? Great. Right. And then one day, one of his classmates, as I was dropping him off, actually it was a girl that was a grade ahead of him, came up to me and said, hey, look, you need to talk to your son. Their kids aren't treating him right. He's being bullied. And even, when I sat down with him, dude, what's up? And it's like, no, everything's fine. So you're right. You're right. Kids aren't telling us everything.
Right. And so that's why I think it's really helpful to read with your kids so that you can open lines of communication.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Speaking of opening, you talk in Unstuck about writer's block and kind of opening that up. I'm imagining, unless you're one of the rare people who never experiences writer's block, that it's happened to you. And if it has, how have you become unstuck?
Well, I never experienced the kind of writer's block that Lila experiences in Unstuck, but I had a period after my first book came out. It did pretty well, and I thought, okay, now I have to write a second book, and it has to be even better. It has to be bigger. It has to be more ambitious. And to do that, I have to do all this research into all these different topics before I can start writing. And so I spent a lot of time in the library and online doing all this research, reading all these books. And one day my kid said to me, what's your book about? And I couldn't answer the question. So I actually, the way that I got over that obstacle was by thinking, okay, I feel like such an imposter. I feel like, I have no talent. I don't know what I'm doing. Maybe I can use that for the character that I'm writing about. And so I used that emotion. And ever since then, I start with an emotion. I start with a character feeling a certain way, and that keeps me connected to my feelings. That's one of the lessons that the teacher in Unstuck tries to teach Lila is write your feelings, stay connected to your feelings. It's not about the research that you're doing. It's not about all the books you've read. It's not about all the charts and graphs and family trees that you produce the way that Lila does, because she thinks she has to do all this very complicated world building before she's allowed to write a fantasy story. That's not what writing is. Writing is expressing yourself, staying connected to your feelings. And every time I hit a roadblock, because like every writer, I may not go through, months of agony. But I have days where I'm not productive, or all I've done is a negative word count, just deleting stuff. But I get through it by thinking, what is this character feeling? How can I express that? And eventually I get through whatever blockage there is.
Yeah. It's interesting. One of our other favorite guests, Rajani Laraka, was on the podcast. And she also
She's a friend of mine. I love Rajani.
She's wonderful. And she said the same thing. When she starts to write, she starts with an emotion.
Yep.
So for all the aspiring writers out there, take it that 2 award-winning authors have been on the podcast and have said the same thing. So maybe it's some good advice to think about. Hey,
and one of the 2 of us is a doctor, so listen to her.
Exactly. Hey, one of the things you mentioned is that Lila's older sister is resisting going to college.
Yes.
One of the things we've talked about here on the podcast is the fact that we put an awful lot of pressure on kids from a very young age to go to college. And it might not be the path for every kid. Could you talk a little bit about that character in that situation?
Dahlia is Lila's older sister. She's a superstar. She's brilliant at everything. She's an athlete. She's a musician. She takes AP courses. All of her grades are great. She was in a writing contest and earned second prize. And so Lila is determined to win first prize. And so Lila is pressuring herself to have this one area where she's, even better than her superstar sister. But I think what happens to the superstar sister is not uncommon for kids in college, kids in high school these days. They have meltdowns. They have so much pressure on them that they just sort of freeze up at a certain point. That's what happens to Dahlia, and she's resisting writing her college essay. So she's going through a certain kind of writer's block too. There are 2 kinds of writer's block in the story. Lila's going through it with her fantasy novel, and Dahlia's going through it with her college essay. But it's not just the essay. It's more that she, the reason she's resisting writing the essay is that she's not sure she wants to go to college, or she's ready to go to college, or she's sort of emotionally in a good space to go to college. She's feeling a lot of anxiety. And so in the story that Lila is writing, she kind of intuits this about her older sister, and the story is about a younger sister saving an older sister, and that's in fact what happens. I don't want to give too much away, but Lila helps her older sister figure a way out of this. One of the problems is that Dahlia doesn't want her parents to know that she doesn't want to go to college, and so that's a secret that Lila has. And that's a burden for Lila, but Lila does help her sister figure out a way to reveal this to her parents and to figure out what the next step should be for Dahlia.
It seems like so many great conversations can come from reading Unstuck together, or co-reading it, whether it's in the van on the way to school or when your kid goes off to sleepaway camp. Do you ever take the time to think about the fact that there are families all over the country, all over the world, that are sitting down and having conversations about your books?
Well, just this morning I saw a graphic on Instagram by a publisher in Iran that publishes my books in Farsi. My books, Halfway Normal and My Life in the Fish Tank, are popular in Iran. And Maybe He Just Likes You is popular in Brazil, and it's got a Turkish edition and a South Korean edition and an Israeli edition. And, I am very touched by the fact that kids all over the world are reading my books. In England, it's Maybe He Just Likes You is required reading in a number of middle schools. Sometimes, the world just feels so overwhelming. And yet when you think about kids in all different countries and different continents sharing the books that kids in this country are reading, you realize that, kids are kids all over the world, and they're going through the same sorts of stuff, and they can relate to the stuff that our kids are going through. I think, it's humbling, it's touching, it's eye-opening for me. I wouldn't have assumed 10 years ago that this would have happened, but it's an amazing thing, and it makes me feel different about the world. It makes me feel different about certain countries. Mm-hmm. I wouldn't have assumed that kids in Iran would want to read a book about a Jewish kid experiencing cancer, but Halfway Normal is very popular in Iran. For whatever reason.
That's fascinating and also really wonderful for you. I'm so delighted and happy for you.
Thank you.
Barbara, where can we go to find out more about Unstuck and find out more about you?
Well, my website is barbardbooks.com, and there's also Simon & Schuster's website, simonandschuster.com. So I would go to either of those two places.
We've had a really great time speaking to the author of Unstuck, new middle grade novel from our friend, Barbara D. Barbara, thanks so much for being with us.
Thank you for having me.
We hope you've enjoyed this episode of the Reading with Your Kids podcast and will join us for the next exciting, informative, and entertaining episode of the show. Want to thank the folks who made today's show so wonderful. Of course, we'll start by thanking our amazing guest. Also want to thank my team, Fatima Khan, Rory Grady, Kyoko Ito, Nick Warner, Sydney Swan, Kayla Newland, Kristen Barrett, Hannah Rose. I want to thank my beautiful wife for all the support she gives me. Most of all, we all want to thank you. Thank you so much for taking the time to join us today. And as always, thank you so very much for taking the time to make the world a better place. And you do that every time you read with your kids. I'll be looking for you in the next edition of the Reading with Your Kids podcast.